Tie stitches are the stitches that keep your embroidery in place. They are 2 or 3 stitches that go back and forth over themselves when you start an element and hopefully when you end an element before a trim. You want to make sure that you have these in place as you're sewing because they will help prevent mistrims, misstarts, and they'll help prevent your embroidery from washing out of your garment. So let's take a look in DesignShop where those tie stitches are. If I look at this lettering that I have up on screen right now, I can right click and go to Properties, and under Tie In and Tie Off I can see what kind of tie stitches I have, and currently I don't have any checked. If I look at the end of these elements, so if I zoom in here, I can see that this stitch just ends. It just comes over to the side, and then there's a trim, and then it would move on to the E. In that case, there's no lock or no tie that is keeping these stitches in place. So if I go into Properties, I can go into Tie In and Tie Off, and I can choose to have them. And I would check in Tie In to have tie-ins. Those are the ones that start the elements. Tie Off. Those are the ones that end the elements. And then I get to choose what kind of style I want. And there are 5 different styles, and they are labeled style 1 through 5. They're very descriptive. Style 1 is a style that goes a full stitch and then a half and then a full, so it does a full, half, full kind of thing. And what's nice about it, if I look in the properties, I can change my width. The default width is 6. That's a nice width for a lot of your tie stitches. I don't know that I would change that very often. The other thing that's really nice is the number of stitches is set to default. Now, with tie stitches, the smaller the element, the less aggressive you need them to be. I don't know if you've ever sewn small lettering and then had to rip it out, but it doesn't come out very easily. For larger stitches, it needs a more aggressive tie stitch. The longer the stitch, the more it stays up out of the fabric, the easier it is to move. So it needs more aggressive of a tie stitch. If I leave my stitches set to default, it will alter the number of stitches based on the width of the stitch line. So smaller elements will have just a couple of stitches, whereas wider elements will have up to, I believe, 5, and that will get it a nice aggressive tie stitch to keep it in place. Now that applies to style 1. Style 2 and style 3 are good for walk stitches only. They sink the needle penetrations, and if I want to see an image of what these look like, I can scroll down and see show tie types. So style 1, forward, back, forward, kind of half full stitches. Style 2 and style 3 sink the needle penetrations directly in where your element needle penetrations are. So on a satin stitch, those are going to sink on either side of the form, and they're not really going to hold in place. For a walk stitch, they're going to fall right in line, and that's going to look nice, but style 1 would do pretty much the same thing. So I tend to stay with style 1 for the majority of my elements. Style 4 sticks outside of the element, and so that would only be applicable if you're going to be covering that up later. The ones that I tend to go between the most are going to be style 1, I use that most of the time, and style 5, which goes to the side of the element and forward and back. It makes a little plus, which is very aggressive and holds things in place very, very nicely. If I was doing something like 3D foam or an application that might require a more aggressive lock stitch, I might consider a style 5. But it is a little bit harder to hide because it goes over to the side. It's harder to hide on small lettering, and anytime you have a tie stitch that does not hide well, it almost shows up like a little dimple or a little bump in your embroidery. So that's not what I'm looking for unless I absolutely have to have it. Style 1 is going to be what I use the majority of the time. I use it for a tie-in, I use it for a tie-off, and then I need to choose when to have it tie. And I have the option of only when necessary or always. And always sounds like a great idea. And if I am digitizing and I'm just doing lettering, I might consider that. But when I think about every travel stitch and every element, that is what always does. It ties in at the beginning and at the end of every single element. So every travel stitch, every column, every fill that you create, there will be a tie stitch on either end of that. And that can create a lot of extra stitches, and you might see a lot of those extra dimples. When I have only when necessary, it is going to tie in at the beginning of a design and sew until it sees a trim. When it sees a trim, it'll tie off, trim, tie in, and start sewing again until it sees another trim. So it sinks a tie stitch at the beginning and end of the design and on either side of any trim. So that's only when necessary. Only when necessary is what I tend to use. If I look down at the bottom, I have auto trim. This means that it will trim anytime I have a connector longer than 64 points, or roughly 1/4 of an inch. So I hit apply and OK, and now I can see that I have a tie stitch right here. It jumps back up and sinks in the middle, 2 to 3 stitches above the end, and that'll sink in nice and tight, and I probably won't see that at actual size. So that's good for a lot of lettering. Now these tie stitches in object properties are meant for wireframe forms. They will not affect expanded files. The other thing that I want to look at is older older wireframe files. If I get a file that was created before this property was available, I'm not going to see tie stitches in that file, but instead, if I look really closely at the end of elements, I may see tie stitches that were manually digitized. So let's take a look at one of those files. If I open something like oneday.ofm, this was created quite a long time ago. And if I right click on design and go to properties, there we go. And I'm under all elements, I've got tie in, tie off selected. I can see that nothing is checked here. However, if I look at the end of this element, so I'm looking at the end of all the green, I see this little walk stitch. And this walk stitch just comes across and back onto itself just a little bit. And that's a manually digitized tie stitch. You will see those on older designs. That doesn't mean that the tie stitches are not there, it just means that they were manually digitized. If I were to go in and add tie stitches through my object properties, that would cause me to double up my tie stitches, and that can sometimes cause me some trimmer issues. It might even cause my trimmers to fail. So I want to look at my designs and see, is this something that I really need to add, or is this something that's already been in there and has been added for me? With the older designs and with the newer designs, you should be able to look at a design, see if the last little bit is a walk stitch that goes over itself. If it is, great, you most likely have tie stitches. If it's not, you'll probably want to add those tie stitches through object properties.